Today, we're going to add surface foam to our animated water shader. Let's go. All right, so we've been working on this water shader for the last couple of weeks. And last week we added depth to the water. But today we're going to add this foam that you can see around the edges of the rocks here. And we're going to do this in 4 stages. First, we're going to talk about the textures that we're going to use. Then I'm going to show you how to create the movement of the foam. Then I'm going to show you how to mask the foam so it just shows up here along the edges of the rocks. And finally, we're going to take a look at how to take this foam and apply it to the rest of our shader. All right, so first we're going to take a look at the textures. All right, so here we are in Photoshop, and these are the 2 textures that we're going to be using today. This is our foam texture that gives the appearance of the foam, and this is our blend ramp texture that helps to define where the foam is going to be applied. These 2 textures both look a little bit weird, so what I'm going to do is break them down for you and show you how they're constructed. So this foam texture, I know it has these weird colors, but what I'm doing is packing the channels. So in the red channel, I have really sparse looking foam, or foam that's not very dense. In the green channel, I have kind of medium foam, and then in the blue channel, I have completely dense and thick foam. And so I have 3 different versions of the foam here. And what I can do is apply these different versions depending on the density of the foam that I want. And so where I don't want very much foam, I can use this red channel foam. Where I want kind of a medium foam, I can use the green channel. And then where I want the foam to be the thickest, I can use the blue channel foam. Okay, so I've got 3 different foam patterns basically packed into the red, green, and blue channels of that texture. All right, and then here is my foam gradient, and this controls how much of those 3 different channels of foam to apply. So if we take a look at the red channel, this gradient, by the way, is going to be applied based on the depth of the water. So where the water is really shallow, where it's bumping up against the rocks and sloshing around, that's where we want it to create the most amount of foam. So this red channel represents where the foam is going to be applied when we're looking at the red channel of the gradient. So basically, this really thin foam is going to get applied everywhere except where the water is the very deepest. So this end of our gradient down here on the left represents deep water, and then this end of the gradient over here on the right represents shallow water. So we're going to be applying this really sparse foam everywhere except where the water is the very deepest. All right, so if we switch over to the green channel, here you can see we're applying our medium foam everywhere except where the water is deepest, but like a little less deep than the sparse foam. And then for the blue channel of the gradient, you can see that we're applying only the really thick foam right here at the end where the water is the shallowest, where it's actually pounding up against the rock and coming into contact with the surface of the rock right there in the shallowest part. Next, I want to show you how we're going to create the movement of the foam. So let's switch back to Unreal. All right, here we are back in Unreal, and I'm going to show you how to do this technique in Unreal first, and then in a minute we're going to switch over to Unity, and I'll show you how to do the same thing there. What we're looking at here is a material function called motion four-way chaos. And this is a material function that ships with the engine. So let me show you how to find it. We just open up our content drawer here and we switch our filter. We come down here so that it only shows us material functions. And now I just type motion. If I select the engine folder down here, this is the folder that ships with Unreal. So all of these material functions come with Unreal. You can see now I have this material function here called motion four-way chaos. That's what we're going to use today to create the animation of the foam. So let's take a look at this function. I'm sampling that, I'm sampling my texture 4 times. You can see my texture samples here. And if we look closely at these, you can see that each of these 4 is scrolling in a different direction. This one's scrolling up and to the left, down and to the right, up and to the right, and down and to the left. So basically we're taking these 4 textures and scrolling them each in a different direction. Now these quality switches here are designed to reduce the cost of the shader depending on the quality that you want. If we're doing high quality, we're going to be sampling all 4 textures. But if we're doing medium or low quality, we're using these quality switches to actually eliminate some of these texture samples to make the shader less expensive to calculate. We're just going to ignore these for now and assume that you're running on high quality so that we can use all 4 of the texture samples. So you can see we're taking these 2 samples and adding them together, and we're taking these 2 samples and adding them together, and then we're taking the results and adding everything all together. So we just take all 4 of our texture samples that are scrolling and add them together so they're scrolling across each other. And then we have this input here called the divisor. So we're just dividing our 4 samples. By default, we're going to divide by 0.24, or sorry, we're going to multiply by 0.25. Basically, that gives us the average of all 4 of these samples after we add them together. Okay, so that is our motion 4-way chaos material function. And this is one that in Unity you don't have to build yourself because, as I said, you can just find it right here in the engine folder. All right, let's open up our shader here. And here's the shader that we've been building for the last couple of weeks. This bit down here creates our surface ripples based on 3 different normal map samples. This bit here creates the Gerstner waves that animates the vertices of the water. And then last week, this is the bit that we created that measures the depth of the water, and we're able to apply various effects based on depth. All right, this week we're going to be creating the foam, and we're going to do that up here. So the first thing that we need to do is add this motion 4-way chaos node. And we're going to bring in a texture object to plug into our motion 4-way chaos. So this texture object is going to be the ocean foam texture that I showed you just a minute ago in Photoshop. So we're going to plug our texture object into our motion 4-way chaos so that it knows this is the texture that we want to scroll. And now we need to give it a couple of values. For coordinates, we're going to use our world space position, our world position node, and we only need the first 2 components, the X and the Y, because we're projecting it top down. And so I'm going to take the world position node, and we need to control the size of it. And so I'm going to multiply that by a constant value of 0.007. And that is going to scale the X and Y of our world position to the proper size for our foam texture. Then I'm just going to plug that into the coordinates. And for speed, I'm just going to give it a value of 1. And then for the divisor, as I said, we're going to give it a value of 0.25. That gets multiplied by the result of all 4 of our textures getting added together. All right, so we've got our motion 4-way chaos going on here. We're sampling our texture object and scrolling it in 4 different directions. So let's take a look at the result that we get from this. So if we look at our shader right now, you know, we've got our water going on here. Actually, let me just switch over to game view really quickly so that our nice little icons don't show up. All right, so here's what our water looks like without the foam. Let's go ahead and take a look at what our motion 4-way chaos node is doing. So I'm going to unplug opacity and world position offset and refraction just for now, just so that we can see what this portion of our shader is doing here. Okay, so there you go. You can see that we have our foam texture, all 3 channels of it, red, green, and blue. and it's scrolling in all 4 directions, and it kind of looks like chaos. For one thing, we're using our channels as color right now, and we need to figure a way to stop using them as color and use them as 3 separate channels of foam. So let's do that first. We'll switch back to our shader here, and if we just split this into our different channels, there's our red, green, and blue channel, and then we can add the individual channels together. So instead of using them as red, green, and blue, now we're using them as 3 separate channels of white to black, like a grayscale value. All right, let's plug this into our base color, and I think we'll get something that looks a little bit more like foam. Yeah, there we go. So now we don't have red, green, and blue foam anymore. We actually have the 3 different channels added together. All right, now we need a way to mask it so that it only shows up like around the edges of the rocks where we want it to be. So let's bring in the other texture, that gradient texture that I showed you a minute ago. So we'll add a texture sample node. And for this node, we're going to look for our Ocean Foam 2 blend ramp. And we're going to sample this blend ramp based on the depth of the water. But first, let's take the result of this ramp and multiply it by our motion 4-way chaos result here. So remember, each of the channels of the ramp is getting multiplied by each of the channels of the foam. And so for the sparse channel of our foam, which is the red channel, we're applying that everywhere except the deepest areas. And then for the medium, it's medium, and then for the really thick foam, we're only applying that where the water is the shallowest. All right, so that is our blend ramp, and now we need to sample this ramp based on our water depth. So let's come down here to our depth. And right here where I've got this 1-, this is the part of our depth where we're adjusting it based on how deep we want it to be. But these values are going to be different for our foam. So I'm just going to take the result of this 1- here and drag it over here. And we divide this by a value that we want to define as our maximum depth. And in this case, I only want the foam to show up right on the edges. And so I'm going to divide it by a value of 40, which is 40 centimeters. So we're only going to show the foam in the areas of our water where it's 40 centimeters deep or less. So we're going to divide our depth by that. Then I'm going to saturate the result. And I'm going to invert it so that we can sample our gradient correctly. So I'm just going to add a 1-. And now we'll use this as the UV coordinates to sample our gradient. So that gradient from white to black is getting applied based on the depth of our water. Okay, now let's take a look at what our result is. So we have our 4-way chaos here. We're multiplying it by our depth gradient, then splitting each of the channels out, and then adding them back together. Oh, and we should probably add a saturate here, just so our value doesn't go higher than 1. So let's go ahead and plug this into our base color and take a look. Okay, and now you can see that I've got the foam showing up exactly where I want it. So everywhere where the surface of the water is coming into contacts that are jutting out of the water, we're getting the foam, and everywhere else we're getting black. Okay, so let's just to make that a little bit more obvious, I'm going to switch our depth to 100 so that you can really see the foam. This isn't how we'll actually use it, but I want you to be able to see exactly what it's doing. Okay, so here we go. You can see that our kind of sparse foam is here on the edges, our medium foam is there, and then our most dense foam is right up against the rocks. Okay, so we don't actually need this much foam, but I did want you to be able to see what the foam was doing. All right, let's switch back to our shader. And the last thing that we need to do is figure out how to integrate this foam with the rest of our shader, because right now we just have foam, but it's not really contributing as it should be to the rest. And so what we're going to do, first of all, is we're going to use this foam directly as our roughness. So wherever the foam is white, our surface is going to be rough, and where it's black, it's going to be smooth. So we don't need this 0 here anymore, because the foam is actually determining the smoothness and the roughness of our surface. All right, the next thing that we need to do is plug our foam into base color. So where we have white for our foam, that's where the surface of our water is going to be white, and everywhere else it's going to be black. Now we could apply a color here, but I found that the water in this case looks pretty good when the color is just black. All right, and then the last thing that we need to do with our foam is we need to add it to our depth right here. So wherever the foam is white, we're going to make it so that our water is opaque in those areas. And then here we'll multiply it by our depth fade so that it fades off right at the edge. So here's our depth, and this is basically wherever our water is opaque. And we're making it so that as we get deeper and deeper, it gets more opaque, but also it's opaque on the surface wherever there's foam. So we've added our foam mask to our opacity here, and then multiplied it by our depth fade just to fade it out at the edges. And so we'll plug this into our opacity, and then we'll plug this back into our refraction. And if I've done everything right, I think that's it. We can hit save and take a look at our final result. Okay, there we go. So we've got foam applied right around the edges of the rocks where the water is impacting the surface. You can see that the foam makes a nice little transition wherever the water comes up and intersects with the rocks. We've got the foam right there on the edges. Pretty cool. All right, so we talked about our foam textures. We talked about creating the movement of the foam with our motion 4-way chaos. And we talked about setting up the foam so that it gets applied based on the water's depth. And then we talked about integrating the foam by adding it to our water opacity here, by using the foam mask as our base color. And that's it. So there is our shader. We have our foam up here at the top. We have our depth, our Gerstner waves, and our surface ripples. All right, there we go. Let's switch over to Unity and take a look at how to add the foam there as well. All right, here we are in Unity, and I want to pick up right where we left off last week, except I added a couple of rocks here to our scene just so that we can get a better idea of what's happening under the surface. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to do before we start adding our foam, because I found a couple of things that we can do to improve the appearance of our water. So let's go ahead and do those. We're going to switch over to our shader here. This is the shader that we've been working on. We're calculating our Gerstner waves here at the top. We've got our UV transforms for our surface ripples here. And then here are our surface ripples. And then this is where we're generating the color of the water. Here we have the opacity and the depth. If you haven't been following along the last couple of weeks, make sure you go back and watch the previous 4 videos first, because in those I show you how to create all of this. And without having this, you're going to be a little bit lost. I'm just going to move these up here to give us some room to create our foam nodes right here in the middle. So let's go ahead and make a couple of adjustments. The first thing that I'm going to do is open up our inspector here and come over to Graph Settings. And there's a setting here called Preserve Specular Lighting. What this does is, even in areas where our water is 100% transparent, it's still going to apply specular and reflections. And we want to turn this off because we want to make it so that the edges of our water are nice and transparent, so that we get rid of the hard edge where the water intersects with the rocks. Let me show you what I mean. So here in our scene, you can see that the water is kind of intersecting with the rocks and it looks kind of unrealistic. So there are actually 3 things that we need to do to fix that. The first one is to turn off that preserve specular lighting in the settings here. The next thing that we need to do is we need to add a new node that's called depth fade. And this node is going to fade the water out right at the edges. I'm going to set the distance to 2, and I'm going to plug this into our opacity, or our alpha channel here. Now, if you're wondering what's in depth fade, this is very similar to what we're doing to compute the depth of the water. So this is what the depth fade subgraph looks like. We just take the scene depth and eye space and subtract the raw screen position alpha channel from it, and then divide by our distance and saturate the result. So that's what the depth fade subgraph looks like. And in this case, what we're doing with depth fade is just fading out the water right at the edges where it intersects with the rock. All right, and so we end up with our result looking like this. Now you can see what's under the water is still quite a bit darker than what's above it. And the reason for that is that our water plane here is set to cast shadows. And so what we're seeing here is the shadow being cast by the water plane. And that's easy to fix. We can just select our water plane, come over here to settings, and set our cast shadows to off. And now you can see we've gotten rid of that ugly looking line that was kind of intersecting, or, wherever the water is intersecting with the rocks. We got that really hard edge. And using those 3 or 4 couple of techniques, we've been able to eliminate that hard line. All right, let's make a couple of other improvements here. One thing that we forgot to do last week is when we calculated the depth, we had the UV coordinates for our scene depth here just using the default screen space. And so what that looked like, it was kind of weird because the depth was static, but the color was being warped. And so we had a result that looks like this. And so what we need to do to fix that is we need to take the result of our warped screen space position here. So here's our screen position, and we're adding this little bit of warp to it. And we need to use that to sample our scene depth here, instead of just the raw screen coordinates that we were using before. That gives us a little bit better result. And then the last thing that I want to do is disconnect this color node, because I think that the kind of a navy blue color was a little bit less realistic than if we just go with the straight black. So that's what we're going to use for now. Yeah, I like this result a little bit better. So we have our black depth, and that looks pretty good. All right, so this is a good place that we can start. We'll go ahead and add the foam to the surface of our water. Oh, one more thing that I want to do. I want to set my maximum depth here to 8 meters as well. I think that'll look a little bit nicer. Yeah, there we go. All right, let's add some foam. So we'll come up here to this empty area, and here is my subgraph called Motion Chaos 4-Way. I've created this subgraph that's very similar to the one that we used in Unreal. And let's just double click on this and take a look at how this is built. So you can see I have 4 sample texture 2D nodes here. And I'm taking the output of those, the RGBA, and adding them together. So I've added these 2 together, then I've added this 3rd one, and I've added the 4th one. And then here we're multiplying by our weight value and then outputting the result. Now, the thing that's important about these 4 texture samples is the way that the texture coordinates are set up. We're basically scrolling the UV coordinates for these 4 texture samples. And the way that we do that is we take time and we multiply it by our speed here. And then we multiply that by 4 separate values, one for each of our samples. So this one gets multiplied by 1, 1, which means it's just scrolling in the default direction. This one gets multiplied by -1, 1. This one gets multiplied by -1, 1. And this one gets multiplied by 1, -1. So we are changing our scrolling direction here based on these 4 values so that we're scrolling our texture in each of the 4 cardinal directions. Then, for 3 of the 4, we're adding offsets. And the reason that we're adding these offset values here is so that our textures never actually hit a point where they line up perfectly. We want to offset them by these random values here so that each sample is kind of in its own space. So we take these 3 values and add them to our scrolling coordinates. Oh, and we also add in here our input UVs. So we have our UVs coming in, we add our offsets, we add our scrolling time, and then that is the UV coordinates that we use to sample each of our textures. All right, so there's our 4-way, our motion chaos 4-way. And we need to sample a texture here. And we're gonna sample that same foam texture that we took a look at a minute ago that we were using in Unreal. All right, for our UV coordinates, we're gonna add a world space position here, and we wanna make sure that we set our world space to absolute world. Then we're gonna add a swizzle node because we only need the X and the Z coordinates, or the X and the Z components. And we'll pass that into our UVs. But the other thing that we need to do is control the scale of these just a little bit. We need to multiply by 0.7 so that we scale our foam down just slightly before we pass our UV coordinates in. All right, for the speed, we're going to use a value of 0.3, and we're going to leave the weight at 0.25. This weight is basically giving us an average of the 4 different foam samples averaged together. All right, so if we take the result of this and plug it into our color, here we can see the result of our motion chaos 4-way in action. Our foam is scrolling, but we've got the different thicknesses, the red, the green, and the blue, all showing up together. So let's go ahead and split out our foam texture into the 4 separate channels and add them together so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. So we'll create a split node here, and then I'm just going to add the red and the green, and then we'll add that together with the blue, and finally we'll saturate the result. And let's plug this into our color and take a look. This is going to look a little bit more like foam. Yeah, there we go. So we have our thick foam, our medium foam, and our sparse foam all added together, and everything is just extremely full of foam everywhere. So the next thing that we need to do is define a mask for where our foam is going to be applied. And the way that we do that is with our texture gradient that I showed you in Photoshop. So let's add another sample texture node here. And we're going to grab our gradient. So this is called Ocean Foam 2. And if we take a look at our texture here, the one thing to remember on the settings for our gradient is to make sure that sRGB is turned off. Let's take a look at our foam texture settings as well. You can see that we also have sRGB set to off for the settings of that texture. Okay, so that we can take the sample of our gradient here and we multiply it by the samples of our foam texture so that the red is multiplied with the red, the green is multiplied with the green, and the blue is multiplied with the blue. And then we do need to add a sampler state node here. This is kind of important. We want to make sure that our gradient is clamped at the edges so that it doesn't continuously tile. So we're going to use our sampler state node to clamp our gradient. All right, now we need the UV coordinates to look up our gradient, and we're going to do that with our depth. So we need to come down here to where we're calculating our depth. And right here where we have our divide, where we are adjusting the value, we're going to divide the result for the foam depth by a different value. So I'm just going to grab the result that's coming out of this subtract node here, and I'll bring it up to where we're working on our foam and add our divide. And I think the maximum depth for this foam is going to be 3 meters instead of 8. So we'll plug a 3. We'll divide our depth by 3. And then we'll saturate the result. And then we'll add a 1 minus. And then we'll use this as the coordinates to look up our gradient. So our gradient's going to be applied based on 3 meters of depth. All right, I think we're ready to save it and take a look at our result. Okay, that looks pretty good. You can see we've got our foam here. Around the edges, we have our sparse foam, and then kind of in the middle, we have our medium foam, and then right up against the rocks, we have our really heavy foam. All right, the last thing that we need to do is take a look at how to take this foam and integrate it with the rest of our shader, because we've got kind of everything else unplugged right now. So here we're calculating the color of our water, and for the color, we can just take our foam and add the color to it and plug that into base color. And then the other place where we need to apply our foam is our smoothness here. Right now we just have our smoothness set to 1, but we can use the opposite of the foam so that wherever the foam isn't, that's where it's smooth. So we're going to add a 1 minus node here and plug that into our smoothness. All right, how are we looking? That's pretty good. All right, there's one last thing that I want to do here, and that is I'm going to take the result of my foam, and here is the set of nodes that's calculating my opacity, the opacity of my water. And I'm going to add the foam mask to that as well, just so that wherever the foam is showing up, we're going to get opaque water in those areas. All right, there we go. So this is our final result here. You can see that wherever the water is intersecting with the edges of our rocks, and even where it intersects with the edges of our tank here, you can see that we've got our nice foam going on. So we've got foam here where the water intersects the edges of our rocks. We've got foam on the edges. We've got our nice depth fade happening. We're blurring, the water is blurring what's happening underneath. We've got a little chromatic aberration happening. And overall, we've got a pretty cool looking water shader. All right, next week, I've had a couple of people ask me how I create the caustics. You can't see the caustics here in Unity right now, but we did have them over in Unreal. So next week, I'll show you how to create a shader that does the water caustics projection. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great week, everybody.